Look at your watch. 60 seconds, 60 minutes, 360 degrees in a circle. Why 60? The answer is 5,000 years old. What if ancient myths weren't just stories, but scientific textbooks encoded in religious language? What if the Anunnaki myths are actually manuals for mathematics, astronomy, engineering, and medicine, hidden in plain sight, waiting to be decoded? Tonight, we're going to crack the code. 7 sciences, preserved for millennia in stories about gods. Knowledge you use every single day without realizing where it came from. Before we begin, if you enjoy these deep explorations of ancient mysteries, a like helps others find this journey. And I'm curious, where are you listening from tonight? And what time is it where you are? Drop a comment. I love seeing how this ancient knowledge connects us across the world. Now, let's decode something you've used at least once today. Let's start with the number 60 and discover why the math you rely on came from myths about gods. The code is about to break open. Chapter 1. Mathematics. The divine number system. Here's a question most people never think to ask. Why do we measure time in 60s? It seems arbitrary, doesn't it? We count most things in tens. 10 fingers, 10 toes, 10 items make a decade, 100 cents in a dollar, 1,000 meters in a kilometer. Base 10 is everywhere in our modern world. It's intuitive, natural. But time runs on 60, and angles, and geographic coordinates. The deeper you look, the more you find this ancient system woven into the fabric of modern life. This isn't an accident, and it isn't arbitrary. It's a gift from the Sumerians, who used a base 60 number system called sexagesimal. They built their entire mathematical framework around the number 60, and 5,000 years later, we're still using it, because it turns out they were right. Base 60 is, for certain applications, superior to base 10. But here's the mystery. How did they know? Base 60 is mathematically elegant in ways that aren't obvious until you really dig into number theory. It divides cleanly by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. That's 10 divisors compared to base 10's 4 divisors. This makes fractions easier, calculations smoother, astronomical measurements more precise. The Sumerians didn't have calculators. They didn't have computers to test different number systems. Yet somehow, they landed on the one that would prove, thousands of years later, to be ideal for the kind of complex calculations that modern civilization depends on. How? Why? Let's decode the myth. In Sumerian mythology, the god Enki is described as the bearer of the Me. Now, me is a difficult word to translate. Scholars usually render it as divine principles or divine powers. But when you look at what the Me actually include, something interesting emerges. They're not abstract virtues. They're concrete things. Kingship, priesthood, truth, music, but also mathematics, measurement, the art of numbers. Enki, according to the myths, organized the cosmos. He brought order to chaos. He established the measurements of heaven and earth. He set the courses of the stars. He divided time into its proper portions. Read literally, as mythology, this is poetic but vague. Enki is a god doing god things, establishing divine order. But read as an encoded technical manual. It transforms. Organizing the cosmos becomes establishing a mathematical framework. Measurements of heaven and earth becomes a unified system for measuring both celestial movements and terrestrial distances. Dividing time becomes creating a calendar, a clock, a system for tracking and predicting. And the number 60 appears over and over in sacred contexts. Anu, the sky god, has 60 divine children. 60 is the number of the great gods. 60 is sacred, perfect, complete. Why 60 specifically? Because it works. Because it's the smallest number divisible by 1 through 6. Because it allows you to express common fractions. 1/2, 1/3, 1/4, 1/5, 1/6 as whole numbers. Try doing that in base 10. You can't. 1/3 of 10 is 3.333, forever. But 1/3 of 60 is 20. Clean, exact, elegant. This matters tremendously if you're doing astronomy. If you're tracking the movements of stars across the sky, you need to divide circles. You need fractions that work cleanly. You need a system that doesn't accumulate rounding errors over thousands of observations. Base 60 gives you that. And the Sumerians knew it. Or someone taught them. The myths tell us that Enki gave this knowledge to humanity. He bestowed the Me, the divine principles, which included the art of measurement and calculation. In the mythological framework, this is a gift from a god. But strip away the divine language, and what you have is a technical manual being transmitted. A mathematical system being taught. And here's where it gets really interesting. The Sumerian mathematical tablets we've recovered show that they understood concepts we think of as advanced. They had something very close to the Pythagorean theorem, more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras. They calculated square roots. They solved quadratic equations. They had multiplication tables and reciprocal tables. These weren't people fumbling around with basic arithmetic. These were sophisticated mathematicians working within an elegant system. And they credited that system to Enki, to the divine Me, to knowledge given rather than discovered. Why frame it this way? Why not just say, we figured out that base 60 is really useful? Because wrapping it in mythology ensures its preservation. If mathematics is just a human invention, it can be questioned, modified, discarded. But if it's a divine gift, if the gods themselves use base 60, then you preserve it. You teach it religiously, literally. You make it sacred, and in making it sacred, you make it permanent. The priests of Enki weren't just performing rituals. They were maintaining mathematical knowledge. The temples weren't just houses of worship. They were schools, where scribes learned the sacred art of calculation. Art that was sacred because it was useful, because it worked, because abandoning it would mean losing the ability to track time, predict celestial events, manage irrigation, conduct trade. 5,000 years later, we're still using their system. When you check your watch, you're using Sumerian mathematics. When you navigate with GPS, which measures your position in degrees, minutes, and seconds, you're using Sumerian mathematics. When you calculate angles in geometry, you're dividing circles the way the Sumerians did. The code worked. The knowledge survived. Encoded in myths about Enki and the Me, wrapped in religious language, preserved through ritual and teaching, base 60 traveled across 5 millennia to arrive in your pocket, in your watch, in every device that measures time or angles or position. That's not primitive superstition. That's brilliant information engineering. That's a civilization that understood something we're only beginning to appreciate. That knowledge is fragile, that civilizations fall, that writing systems are forgotten, but that stories, properly constructed, can carry technical information across the ages. The Sumerians, or whoever taught them, looked at the problem of knowledge preservation and solved it. They encoded their mathematics in mythology. They made it sacred so it would be protected. They made it narrative so it would be remembered. They made it religious so it would be taught. And every time you glance at a clock, you're proving that they succeeded. 60 seconds. 60 minutes. 360 degrees. The divine number, given by Enki, used by you, 5,000 years later, still working exactly as intended. Sleep on that for a moment. Let it settle. The mathematics you use without thinking, the numbers that structure your day, came from myths about gods. And those myths were designed, carefully and cleverly, to make sure you'd still have those numbers 5,000 years later. The code is breaking open, and we've only just begun. Chapter 2. Astronomy. Mapping the invisible. Now let's look up. On a clear night, far from city lights, you can see about 2,000 stars with your naked eye. Maybe 3,000 if your vision is exceptional and the sky is perfectly dark. The ancients saw the same stars we do. They watched them wheel across the heavens, night after night, season after season, year after year. And they mapped them. They grouped them into constellations. They tracked their movements with remarkable precision. The Sumerians knew things about the sky that they shouldn't have been able to know. Not with the technology available to them. Not without telescopes or computers or satellites. They knew about planets that are invisible to the naked eye. They understood cycles that take thousands of years to complete. They predicted celestial events with accuracy that wouldn't be matched again until the invention of modern astronomical instruments. How? Let's start with something called precession. It's the slow wobble of Earth's axis, like a spinning top that's starting to lose momentum. This wobble takes 26,000 years to complete one full cycle. Because of it, the position of stars relative to the horizon shifts gradually over centuries. The North Star changes. The zodiac constellations drift through the seasons. 26,000 years. You can't observe that in a human lifetime. You can't even observe it across several generations. To detect precession, you need astronomical records spanning millennia. You need to compare observations made by people separated by hundreds or thousands of years. You need institutional continuity, preserved records, and the mathematical tools to interpret long-term patterns. The Sumerians knew about precession. They divided it into 12 ages, each lasting 2160 years. The Age of Taurus, the Age of Aries, the Age of Pisces, ages we still reference today. But here's the question. How did they accumulate 26,000 years of astronomical data? Even if we assume they were carefully recording observations from their civilization's beginning, Sumerian civilization only lasted about 2,000 years. Where did the rest of the data come from? The myths give us an answer, but you have to know how to read them. Anu, the supreme sky god, represents the heavens themselves. He's described as dwelling in the highest heaven, surrounded by stars. His throne room is the celestial sphere, and around him are his children, divine beings, each associated with specific stars or planets. Now, on the surface, this is just mythological imagery. Gods in heaven, surrounded by heavenly things. Poetic, but not particularly meaningful. But look closer at the details. The myths list specific numbers of divine attendants, specific arrangements, specific relationships between different celestial deities. And when you map those relationships onto the actual sky, patterns emerge. The family tree of gods corresponds to the positions of stars. The marriages between deities mark conjunctions of planets. The births of divine children track astronomical cycles. The genealogies aren't just stories. They're star charts. The divine family is a map of the heavens, encoded in narrative form. Why do this? Same reason they encoded mathematics in the ME. Stories are memorable. Genealogies are memorable. You can memorize a family tree far more easily than you can memorize columns of astronomical coordinates. And if you encode the coordinates in the family tree, the knowledge survives, even if the technical documentation is lost. This is sophisticated information design. This is understanding that raw data is vulnerable, but narrative is robust. This is building redundancy into your knowledge preservation system. The Sumerians also tracked what they called the 50 great gods. Modern scholars initially thought this was arbitrary religious symbolism. 50 is just a number. Right. Lots of gods in the pantheon might as well make it an even 50. Except it isn't arbitrary. 50 is significant in Sumerian astronomy. It's connected to the orbital period of planets. It appears in calculations related to precession. It shows up in temple architecture aligned to celestial events. 50 isn't random. It's encoded data. When myths describe the assembly of the 50 great gods, they might be describing a comprehensive astronomical reference system. 50 key celestial markers, memorized as 50 divine beings, each with specific attributes that encode their position, movement, and significance. You don't need to understand astronomy to memorize the gods. You just need to remember the stories. But if you do understand astronomy, you can decode the stories and extract precise celestial data. It's a two-tier system. For the general population, it's religion. For the initiated, it's science. Consider the zodiac itself. 12 constellations marking the sun's path through the sky over the course of a year. We still use them. Astrology might be pseudoscience, but the astronomical framework underlying it is sound. The zodiac is a coordinate system, a way of dividing the sky into measurable sections. The Sumerians established this system, or rather, they preserved it, encoded it, transmitted it, and they did so by making it sacred. Each constellation became associated with a deity, with myths, with religious significance. This wasn't superstition replacing knowledge. This was knowledge being wrapped in superstition for protection. Priests who maintained the zodiac weren't just performing empty rituals. They were preserving an astronomical coordinate system. They were teaching the next generation how to orient themselves relative to the stars. They were maintaining humanity's ability to navigate, to mark time, to predict seasons. And they were doing something else, something even more remarkable. They were preserving knowledge of planets beyond normal human vision. The Sumerians had names and symbols for celestial bodies that don't appear as more than faint dots in the night sky. Bodies whose existence wouldn't be confirmed by modern astronomy until the invention of powerful telescopes. How did they know these planets existed? One possibility: they didn't. We're misinterpreting their texts, seeing planets where they meant something else entirely. Another possibility: they had better observational capabilities than we give them credit for. Perhaps exceptionally clear desert skies and a lifetime of careful observation could reveal faint planets invisible to casual stargazers. Or a third possibility, the one the myths themselves suggest. They were taught. Someone who already knew the layout of the solar system shared that knowledge, and it was encoded in divine genealogies, in the family trees of gods, in stories about celestial beings and their relationships. We can't know for certain, but we can observe the result. Sumerian astronomy was remarkably accurate. Their star charts work. Their calendars functioned. Their understanding of celestial mechanics was sophisticated enough that later civilizations, the Babylonians, the Greeks, the Romans, built their own astronomical systems on Sumerian foundations. The knowledge survived. Through the fall of Sumer, through the rise and fall of Babylon, through countless wars and invasions and the collapse of empires, the astronomical knowledge encoded in myths about the gods of heaven survived. We're still using it. The zodiac, the division of the circle into 360 degrees, matching the approximate days in a year. The names of planets: Jupiter, Venus, Mars, Saturn, derived from the gods associated with them. Mercury, the swift messenger for the fastest moving planet. Venus, goddess of beauty, for the brightest. Mars, god of war, for the red one. These aren't coincidences. They're a knowledge transmission system that has functioned for 5,000 years. Every time you say the name of a planet, you're speaking a word that carries Sumerian astronomical knowledge. Every time you reference your zodiac sign, you're using a coordinate system they established. Every time you measure an angle in degrees, you're working within their framework. The myths encoded the cosmos. The gods mapped the sky. And we inherited both the myths and the maps, often without realizing they're the same thing. Anu's throne room, filled with divine beings, each with their place and purpose and name. It's a planetarium, a model of the heavens, built in narrative, designed to survive the collapse of any individual civilization because it's embedded in multiple civilizations' stories. That's not primitive. That's visionary. That's understanding that knowledge must be preserved across timescales longer than any kingdom or empire can survive. That's designing a knowledge capsule that will outlive its creators by thousands of years. And when you look up at the night sky tonight, and you see the stars in their familiar patterns, arranged in constellations with ancient names, marking out the zodiac's path, you're looking at that capsule. You're seeing what the Sumerians saw. You're connected to 5,000 years of humans looking up at the same stars and reading the same encoded knowledge in their positions. The code is written in the stars themselves. And thanks to myths about gods in heaven, we can still read it. Chapter 3. Hydraulic Engineering. The Water Code. Water is life. And in ancient Mesopotamia, water was everything. The land between the rivers. That's what Mesopotamia means. The Tigris and Euphrates, flowing down from the mountains, bringing life to a landscape that would otherwise be desert. But these rivers were unpredictable. They flooded violently in spring when mountain snow melted. They could shift course, abandoning cities that depended on them. They could bring too much water, drowning crops, or too little, leaving fields to wither. Survival meant controlling water, not just using it, but managing it, directing it, storing it, distributing it precisely where and when it was needed. This required engineering, sophisticated hydraulic engineering, and the Sumerians mastered it. They transformed marshland and desert into the most productive agricultural region in the ancient world. They built canal systems so effective that some of them were still in use 4,000 years later. They understood water pressure, flow rates, gradients, erosion control. They built reservoirs, aqueducts, drainage systems, and irrigation networks that modern engineers study with respect. How did they learn this? How did farmers and shepherds suddenly develop advanced hydraulic engineering knowledge? The myths tell us, but again, you have to decode them. Enki. We've met him before, as the keeper of the ME, the divine principles that included mathematics. But Enki has another title, Lord of the Abzu, Lord of the sweet waters beneath the earth. The Abzu is described in myths as the primordial freshwater ocean beneath the ground, the source of all rivers and springs. Enki dwells there, in his underwater palace, controlling the flow of water to the world above. He's the master of water, the one who organizes the streams, who fills the Tigris and Euphrates, who makes the waters flow where they are needed. Read as mythology, this is creation story material. A god who controls water from his mystical underwater realm. Standard ancient cosmology. But read as engineering manual. It transforms completely. The Abzu isn't mystical. It's the aquifer, the underground water table that the Sumerians learned to tap with wells. Enki, dwelling in the Abzu, encodes the knowledge that fresh water exists beneath the ground, accessible if you know how to reach it. Organizing the streams isn't a divine miracle. It's hydraulic engineering, planning canal networks, understanding that water flows downhill, that you can direct it with channels, that you can create distribution systems that deliver water where it's needed. Filling the Tigris and Euphrates describes the relationship between the rivers and their tributaries, between surface water and groundwater, between the natural hydrology of the region and human intervention in that system. Every divine act that Enki performs with water corresponds to an engineering principle or technique, and those techniques, encoded as myths about a god, survived to be decoded by people who needed them. Let's look at specifics. There's a myth about Enki and the goddess Ninhursag, where Enki causes plants to grow by bringing water to them in a specific sequence. First he waters the reeds, then the grain, then the date palms, each in their proper time and measure. Surface reading, a god makes things grow. Nice story. Engineering reading. This is a description of optimal irrigation scheduling. Different crops need water at different times in their growth cycles. Reed beds, which stabilize canal banks and prevent erosion, are established first. Then grain, planted at the start of the growing season. Then date palms, which require consistent water but can tolerate some drought once established. This isn't just water your plants. This is a sophisticated agricultural timetable, encoding crop rotation, irrigation scheduling, and water management strategies. And it's preserved in a story about a god performing miracles. Another myth describes Enki separating the salt water from the sweet water. The Tigris and Euphrates flow into the Persian Gulf, where fresh water meets seawater. This mixing zone was crucial for Sumerian civilization. They had to manage it, had to prevent salt water from contaminating their irrigation systems, had to understand the dynamics of how fresh water and salt water interact. Enki, separating the waters, encodes that knowledge. It describes the need to maintain freshwater purity, to prevent saltwater intrusion into canals, to manage the interface between different water sources. It's hydraulic engineering, described as divine action, preserved in myth. The temples of Enki weren't just places of worship. They were located at hydraulically significant points, at the junction of major canals, at places where wells accessed the aquifer, at nodes in the water distribution network. And the priests of Enki weren't just performing empty rituals. They were water managers. They maintained the canals. They organized the distribution of water to farmers. They kept records of water levels, flood timing, drought cycles, religious calendar. Also, irrigation schedule. The festivals of Enki aligned with critical moments in the agricultural year. Times when canals needed to be cleared of silt. Times when gates needed to be opened or closed to manage flow. Times when wells needed maintenance. Make these tasks sacred, and you ensure they get done. Make water management a religious obligation, and you create institutional continuity. The temples don't just preserve knowledge about water, they actively maintain the physical infrastructure that the knowledge describes. Consider how you'd teach hydraulic engineering without written technical manuals, or with the understanding that written manuals might not survive. You embed it in religion. You make the god of water the personification of hydraulic principles. You create myths that, when acted out in ritual, train people in proper water management. You build temples at critical infrastructure points and make maintaining that infrastructure a sacred duty. The canals of Mesopotamia weren't just dug randomly by trial and error. They show planning. They show understanding of topography, of gradient, of flow dynamics. Some canals were over 100 miles long, maintaining a precise, gentle slope the entire way. Too steep, and the water erodes the channel. Too shallow, and it stagnates. They got it right, consistently, across vast distances. How? The myths of Enki encode the principles. The god made the water flow smoothly in its channels translates to maintain proper gradient in your canals. He prevented the waters from overflowing translates to build adequate levees and overflow channels. He ensured each field received its portion translates to design distribution systems with gates and measuring weirs. Modern engineers excavating ancient Mesopotamian canal systems find that they're brilliantly designed, that they demonstrate understanding of principles that weren't formally described in Western engineering texts until the modern era. But those principles were there, working, 5,000 years ago. Encoded in myths, preserved in religious practice, maintained by priests who may or may not have fully understood the engineering principles they were implementing, but who followed the sacred instructions and kept the water flowing. That's how you preserve technical knowledge across millennia. You don't just write it down. Writing can be lost, burned, forgotten. You encode it in multiple formats. In myths that explain why water management matters. In rituals that teach the actual procedures. In temple locations that mark critical infrastructure points. In religious obligations that ensure maintenance continues. The water still flows. The ancient canals, where they haven't been destroyed by modern development or war, still work. The wells still access the aquifer. The principles are sound. Enki's gift wasn't mystical. It was technical. The Lord of Waters wasn't dispensing magic. He was teaching hydraulic engineering. And he did it so well, wrapped the knowledge so cleverly in religious narrative, that it survived long enough for us to decode it, to recognize it, to see it for what it was. Every time a Sumerian farmer opened a canal gate to water his fields, he was performing a ritual act, but he was also implementing hydraulic engineering. The two were inseparable. The sacred was practical, the myth was manual, and the water flowed where it was needed, because someone, 5,000 years ago, understood that knowledge must be preserved in forms that survive beyond any individual teacher or student, beyond any single generation, beyond even the civilization that first discovered it. The code was written in water. The manual was disguised as mythology. And for thousands of years, it worked exactly as intended, keeping civilizations alive in a desert that should have been uninhabitable. That's not superstition. That's genius. That's understanding knowledge preservation at a level we're only beginning to appreciate. The waters still remember, and if you know how to listen, if you know how to decode the myths, Enki is still teaching. Chapter 4. Genetics. The Creation Code. Now we're going to tackle something controversial, something that makes scholars uncomfortable, something that sounds, at first hearing, absolutely ridiculous. But stay with me, because when you decode this particular myth, when you look at what it actually describes, step by step, procedure by procedure, it becomes very difficult to dismiss. We're talking about the Sumerian creation story, the story of how humans were made. You probably know a version of this already. Most cultures have creation myths, but the Sumerian version is specific, unusually specific. It describes a process, with steps, with materials, with trial and error, with failed attempts before success. It reads less like a creation myth and more like a laboratory report. Let's walk through it. Slowly, carefully, looking at what it actually says. According to the texts, the gods decided they needed workers, beings who could labor, who could maintain the irrigation systems and farms, who could serve in the temples. The younger gods were tired of doing all this work themselves, so the senior gods, specifically Enki and the goddess Ninhursag, decided to create a new type of being. They took clay from the earth, and they mixed it with blood from a god. Specifically, blood from a god who was sacrificed for this purpose. They mixed these materials in what the texts call a vessel or container. They performed this process multiple times, with different ratios, different procedures. Most attempts failed. The created beings were flawed. Couldn't speak, couldn't reproduce, couldn't survive. 7 attempts are described, each producing a different kind of failure. Finally, on the 8th attempt, they succeeded. They created viable humans, beings who could think, work, reproduce. The prototype was called Adapa. From him, humanity descended. Now, read as mythology. This is interesting, but not extraordinary. Gods create humans from earth and divine essence. It's a creation story. Many cultures have similar tales, but read it as encoded genetics. Look what it describes. Clay from the earth. What's the primary element in clay? Carbon. What are we made of? Carbon-based organic molecules. Earth could encode the concept of base biological material, the raw chemical building blocks of life. Blood from a god. What's blood? It carries genetic information, DNA. The instructions for building an organism. Divine blood could encode the concept of genetic material from an advanced source, information to be inserted into the base material, mixed in a vessel. A container where materials combine. A laboratory setting. A controlled environment where biological materials interact. Multiple attempts. Trial and error. Experimentation. The first tries don't work. You have to refine the procedure. Adjust the ratios. Try different approaches. Failed creations. Organisms that aren't viable. That can't survive. Can't reproduce. Can't function properly. Exactly what you'd expect in genetic experimentation. Most attempts fail. Success is rare. Final success. A viable organism. One that works. That can reproduce. That creates a stable lineage. This is unsettlingly similar to how genetic engineering actually works. Take base biological material. Insert genetic information from another source. Multiple attempts, most failures, eventual success. If you were describing genetic engineering to someone who had no scientific framework for understanding it, who lived 5,000 years ago, you might describe it exactly this way. Clay and divine blood. Earth and heaven. Matter and information combined in a vessel through a process of trial and error. Now, here's where it gets even stranger. The texts describe Ninhursag's role very specifically. She's called the mother of all living things. She's associated with the womb, with gestation, with birth. But her title is also Lady of the Rib, or Lady of Life. The rib. Where have we heard that before? Right. The biblical story of Eve being created from Adam's rib. That story comes later, borrowed from earlier Mesopotamian sources. But in the Sumerian version, it's not about creating a woman from a man. It's about Ninhursag using a rib. A bone, containing marrow, containing genetic material. As part of the creation process, bone marrow is where blood cells are produced, where genetic material is constantly being generated. If you wanted to extract genetic information from an organism, bone marrow would be an excellent source. Lady of the Rib might encode expertise in using skeletal material for genetic purposes. This sounds insane. I know it does. But the description is there, in 5,000-year-old texts, describing a process that maps remarkably well onto genetic engineering. And we have to ask, why would an ancient people describe creation this way? Why the specificity? Why the trial and error? Why the technical details about materials and containers and procedures? Most creation myths are vaguer. God spoke and humans appeared. The gods shaped humans from mud. Simple. magical. The Sumerian version isn't simple. It's procedural. It's describing a process that takes time, that requires expertise, that fails multiple times before succeeding. If you wanted to encode knowledge about genetic manipulation, and this is a big if, I'm not saying this is definitely what happened, but if you wanted to preserve that knowledge, how would you do it? You couldn't use modern scientific terminology. Your audience wouldn't understand DNA or genetic engineering or recombinant genetics. You'd have to use concepts they could grasp: clay, blood, vessel, mixing, trial, error, success. These are concrete, understandable concepts, and they map, metaphorically but accurately, onto the actual process of genetic modification. One more detail. The texts say that after humans were created, the gods mixed their divine essence with earthly matter, and that humans therefore carry something of the divine within them. We're part earth, part heaven, part animal, part something more. What's that describing? A hybrid, an organism that combines genetic material from two different sources. We're not purely of earth. We're not just another animal that evolved naturally. We're something else. Something created by combining earth material with something additional. Modern genetics has confirmed something interesting. Human evolution has some puzzling gaps. Some jumps that seem too rapid to be purely natural selection. Our brains developed much faster than evolutionary timelines would predict. We have genetic markers that don't appear in our supposed evolutionary ancestors. There are mysteries in our DNA that science doesn't fully explain yet. I'm not saying ancient aliens did it. I'm not claiming the Anunnaki were literal extraterrestrials in laboratories. But I am saying that the Sumerian creation myth describes a process that sounds remarkably like genetic engineering, with a level of procedural detail that's unusual for mythology, and that perhaps, just perhaps, this is encoded knowledge about human origins that's more sophisticated than we've given it credit for. Or maybe it's purely metaphorical. Maybe the Sumerians understood that humans are a mixture of the earthly and something transcendent, something that makes us different from other animals, and they expressed that philosophical insight through the metaphor of clay and divine blood. But if it is just metaphor, it's oddly specific metaphor. It's metaphor that maps almost perfectly onto a real scientific process. It's metaphor that describes, step by procedural step, how you'd actually go about genetic modification. The code here is harder to crack with certainty than the mathematical or astronomical codes. We can verify that base 60 works for calculations. We can confirm that Sumerian star charts are accurate. But genetic engineering 5,000 years ago, that's a much bigger claim. One that requires much stronger evidence. What we can say is this: the Sumerian creation myth describes a process, a detailed, specific process with steps and materials and failures and eventual success. That process maps remarkably well onto genetic engineering. Whether that's because the Sumerians witnessed something like genetic engineering and encoded it, or because they intuitively understood something about heredity and variation and biological design, or because it's pure coincidence. We can't know for certain. But we can't dismiss it either. Not when every other myth we've decoded so far has turned out to contain real, verifiable scientific knowledge. Not when the pattern is so consistent. Not when the details align so precisely. Enki and Ninhursag in their laboratory, mixing clay and divine blood, creating humans through trial and error. Maybe it's metaphor. Maybe it's history. Maybe it's encoded genetics. Or maybe it's all three. Maybe it's a memory of something that really happened, encoded as myth so it would survive, carrying within it both literal information and symbolic truth. The code is there. Whether we have the key to fully decode it. That's the question. That's the mystery that keeps scientists and scholars arguing after 5,000 years. But one thing is certain. The Sumerians didn't describe creation as a simple magical act. They described it as a process. A complex, difficult, failure-prone process that eventually succeeded. And that description, whether you interpret it literally or metaphorically, carries profound implications about how they understood life, creation, and what humans actually are. Part clay, part divine blood, part earth, part heaven. Created, not evolved. Designed, not accidental. carrying within us something that came from somewhere else, mixed with the basic materials of this planet. That's the code. That's what the myth encodes. And whether it's literal genetic history or profound philosophical insight, it's knowledge worth preserving. Knowledge that survived 5,000 years, waiting for us to develop the scientific framework to fully understand what it might be saying. The creation code is the most controversial, the most disputed, the most difficult to decode with certainty. But it's also, perhaps, the most important, because it's not just about ancient history. It's about us, about what we are, about where we came from. And the Sumerians encoded their answer in clay and blood, mixed in a vessel, through trial and error, until something viable emerged. Something that could survive. Something that could carry the code forward into an unknown future. Us. Chapter 5. Agriculture. The Cultivation Code. Let's talk about wheat. Not the most exciting topic, perhaps, but wheat changed everything. Wheat allowed humans to stop wandering and start settling. Wheat made cities possible. Wheat is the foundation of civilization itself. Wild wheat exists. It grows in scattered patches across the Fertile Crescent. But wild wheat is difficult. The seeds scatter when ripe, making them hard to harvest. The grains are small and protected by tough husks. The plants grow irregularly, some tall, some short, yielding unpredictably. Domesticated wheat is different. The seeds stay on the stalk until harvested. The grains are larger and easier to thresh. The plants grow uniformly, predictably. Domesticated wheat is a superior organism, engineered, or rather, bred, for human use. This transformation, from wild to domesticated, should take many generations, hundreds of years of careful selection, slowly identifying plants with desirable traits, saving their seeds, planting them, selecting again, generation after generation, gradually shifting the genetics of the population until you have something reliably useful. But in the archaeological record, wheat domestication happens fast, very fast. Within a few centuries, wild wheat becomes fully domesticated wheat. Multiple crops. Wheat, barley, lentils, peas are domesticated almost simultaneously in the same region. It's not a gradual process spread across a millennium. It's a sudden transformation. How? The myths give us an answer. And as with everything else we've decoded, it's hidden in plain sight. The gods taught agriculture. Specifically, they taught which plants to cultivate, how to cultivate them, when to plant, when to harvest. This knowledge was a gift, bestowed on humanity so we could stop wandering and start building. Read as mythology. Gods help humans. Nice story about divine benevolence. Read as encoded agricultural science. Someone who already understood selective breeding, crop rotation, soil management, and harvest timing transmitted that knowledge. And it was preserved as stories about gods giving gifts. Let's look at the details. There's a myth about the goddess Ashnan, the grain goddess. She's described as having 7 names and being associated with 7 types of grain. 7 specific cultivated grains that form the foundation of Mesopotamian agriculture. Wheat, barley, and 5 others, each with specific growing requirements, specific uses, specific places in the agricultural cycle. Her 7 names aren't just poetic. They encode information. Each name is associated with a specific grain, and each grain has specific cultivation requirements encoded in the myths surrounding it. When to plant it relative to the flood cycle, what soil it prefers, how much water it needs, when to harvest for optimal yield. This isn't vague agricultural blessing. This is a detailed cultivation manual, disguised as the attributes of a goddess. Another myth describes the god Encode, the lord of dike and canal, who is associated with the farmer's calendar. He's in conflict with Dumuzi, the shepherd god, over the affections of Inanna. This conflict, farmer versus shepherd, represents the transition from pastoral nomadism to settled agriculture. But it also encodes something more practical. The rivalry describes the balance between farming and herding. You can't farm every piece of land. Some must be left for grazing. Livestock provides fertilizer for fields. fields provide fodder for livestock. The conflict that's eventually resolved represents the understanding that agriculture and animal husbandry must work together, that optimal food production requires integrating both. Enkidu's association with dike and canal links agriculture directly to irrigation. You can't just scatter seeds and hope for rain in Mesopotamia. You need controlled water delivery. The farmer god is also an irrigation engineer. The two are inseparable. And that knowledge, that successful agriculture in this region requires hydraulic management, is encoded in the divine identity. The agricultural calendar itself was sacred. Festivals marked planting times, irrigation times, harvest times, but these weren't arbitrary religious dates. They were practical agricultural scheduling, encoded as religious obligation. The New Year festival, Akitu, coincided with spring planting. Celebrations included ritual plowing, blessing of seeds, prayers to grain goddesses, but the practical effect was synchronizing the entire region's planting schedule. Everyone plants at the optimal time because everyone observes the same sacred calendar. Midsummer festivals coincided with critical irrigation periods. You had to water the crops at the right time or they'd fail. Make it a religious obligation, a sacred festival, and you ensure people do it even when it's difficult, even when they're tired, even when they'd rather not. Harvest festivals occurred precisely when crops reached optimal maturity. Religious celebration motivated people to bring in the harvest promptly, before weather could damage it. Sacred obligation ensured labor was available when needed. The calendar wasn't just religious. It was agricultural. The two were fused, inseparable. And by making agriculture sacred, by embedding crop management in religious practice, the Sumerians ensured that knowledge would be preserved and followed. Consider seed preservation. The temples of grain goddesses stored seeds, sacred seeds, blessed by the goddess, to be planted the following season. This wasn't superstition. This was maintaining genetic lineages, keeping the best seeds separate, preventing contamination with wild varieties, ensuring each year's planting started with proven, successful genetic stock. The priestesses of Ashnan weren't just praying over grain. They were managing a seed bank. They were maintaining the genetic integrity of domesticated crops. They were performing practical agricultural science under the guise of religious ritual. Why fuse science and religion? Because religion ensures continuity. A purely practical instruction, save seeds from your best plants, might be forgotten or ignored or modified based on individual judgment. But a religious commandment, backed by divine authority and community enforcement, is followed consistently, generation after generation. The temples also recorded harvest yields, offerings to the gods, measured and documented. But these records weren't just religious bookkeeping. They were agricultural data, tracking which fields produced the best yields, which varieties performed well in which conditions, noting the relationship between weather, irrigation, and productivity. This data accumulated over centuries, maintained by temple scribes, and it allowed for optimization, for understanding patterns, for making better decisions about what to plant, where, when to irrigate, how to maximize yield. The gods didn't perform agricultural miracles, but their priesthoods accumulated agricultural knowledge, encoded it in myth and ritual, and ensured its preservation and transmission across generations. There's a Sumerian proverb: the farmer is the beloved of Enlil. Enlil, remember, is the god of wind and storm, of the atmosphere between heaven and earth. Why would he especially love farmers? Because farmers depend on weather, on rain at the right time, on the absence of storms during harvest. Agricultural success requires understanding meteorological patterns, planting schedules that account for seasonal weather, irrigation systems that supplement natural rainfall. Beloved of Enlil might encode the knowledge that successful farming requires atmospheric awareness, that you have to work with weather patterns, not against them, that the farmer who understands the sky is the farmer who succeeds. Even crop rotation is encoded in myths. The story of fields resting every 7th year, being dedicated to the gods, not planted. This preserves soil fertility. Continuous planting depletes nutrients. Fields need periodic rest to recover. Make it a religious obligation. The land belongs to the gods, and every 7th year, you must let them have it back. And you ensure farmers follow sustainable practices, even when short-term profit might tempt them to over-farm. The Sumerians understood that intensive agriculture could destroy land. They'd seen it happen. Salinization from over-irrigation, soil exhaustion from continuous planting, erosion from poor management, and they encoded sustainable practices in religious law because that was the only way to ensure people would follow them long-term. 5,000 years later, we're relearning these lessons. Crop rotation, soil management, sustainable irrigation, genetic seed banking, integrated crop and livestock systems. The agricultural science we're rediscovering was encoded in Sumerian myths about gods and goddesses, preserved through religious practice, maintained by temple institutions. The code is agricultural. The manual teaches cultivation, and it worked for thousands of years, keeping Mesopotamia fertile, keeping cities fed, keeping civilization alive in a challenging environment. The grain goddess wasn't magic. She was the personification of agricultural knowledge, and worshipping her meant practicing good farming, following the calendar, managing water, selecting seeds, rotating crops, letting fields rest, recording yields, sharing knowledge across the community. Religion and science fused into one system, each reinforcing the other, creating a knowledge preservation and transmission mechanism that outlasted the civilization that created it. We're still eating wheat descended from Sumerian fields. Still, using agricultural techniques, they encoded, still following calendars based on seasons they identified, still benefiting from the god's gift, which was never magic, but always knowledge, carefully wrapped in stories that would survive any catastrophe. The cultivation code ensured that humans would never forget how to feed themselves. That even if civilization collapsed, if cities burned, if libraries were destroyed, the knowledge of how to grow food would survive in stories about gods and goddesses who loved humanity enough to teach us the secrets of the soil. And every time you eat bread, you're tasting the success of that code. You're consuming the fruit of knowledge, preserved across 5,000 years, encoded by people brilliant enough to understand that science, wrapped in sacred stories, would outlive science written in technical manuals. The harvest continues. The gods still provide, not through miracles, but through encoded knowledge, patiently waiting to be decoded and understood and appreciated for the sophisticated preservation system it always was. Chapter 6. Metallurgy. The Forge Code. Fire transforms. That's its magic. That's its power. Take dull rock from the ground. Apply fire at the right temperature, and out flows gleaming metal. Copper, red and malleable. Silver, bright and precious. Gold, eternal and uncorrupting. To ancient peoples, this must have seemed like literal magic. Earth becoming something fundamentally different through the power of fire. But it's not magic. It's chemistry. It's metallurgy. And it's remarkably complicated. Bronze, the metal that defined an entire age, isn't found in nature. It doesn't exist as ore you can mine. Bronze is an alloy. Copper and tin, combined in specific ratios at specific temperatures, creating a material superior to either component alone. Here's the puzzle. Copper and tin aren't usually found together. Copper sources and tin sources are geographically separate, sometimes hundreds of miles apart. You need to identify both metals, transport them, understand that combining them produces something better, figure out the correct ratio. About 90% copper, 10% tin. And master the smelting temperature that allows them to fuse properly. This is not intuitive. This is not something you stumble upon by accident. This requires knowledge, experimentation, technical understanding. And it appeared, in the archaeological record, remarkably suddenly. Cultures jumped from pure copper to sophisticated bronze work within relatively brief periods. The knowledge seemed to spread rapidly, almost as if it was being taught rather than slowly discovered. The myths, again, give us an answer. And the answer involves divine smiths, sacred forges, and gods who knew the secrets of metalworking. In Sumerian mythology, there's Ninurta, the warrior god, who possesses 50 divine weapons. 50. Not 10, not 100. 50 specific weapons, each with a name, each with specific properties, each made through specific processes. On the surface, this is just mythology. A god has many weapons. He's powerful. He uses them in battles against monsters and chaos. Typical hero story. But look at the details. The 50 weapons aren't all the same. They're categorized. Some cut, some pierce, some crush, some are for close combat, some are ranged. Each has specific attributes, specific compositions, specific forging requirements described in the myths. 50 types. Could these encode 50 metallurgical formulas, 50 different alloys and metalworking techniques? Each divine weapon representing a specific combination of metals, specific heat treatment, specific forging method. If you wanted to preserve metallurgical knowledge in oral tradition, how would you do it? You can't just memorize recipes. Heat copper to 1085 degrees Celsius, add 10% tin, stir, cool slowly. That's too abstract, too easy to get wrong, too vulnerable to copying errors across generations. But give each formula a name. Make it a divine weapon with a story. Describe its properties through the battles it wins. Encode the metal composition in the god who wields it, the temperature in the forge it comes from, the technique in the ritual of its creation. That's memorable. That survives. The smith god, in many mythologies, isn't just strong. He's specifically described as knowing secrets, hidden knowledge, the mysteries of the forge. Why mysteries? Why hidden? Because metallurgy is complicated, dangerous if done wrong, and valuable enough to protect. Making bronze requires understanding not just the copper-tin ratio, but also the order of operations. Add tin to molten copper, not the other way around. Control the temperature carefully during cooling to avoid brittleness. Reheat and hammer the finished product to improve strength through work hardening. These aren't obvious steps. These are technical procedures that must be done correctly, or the product fails. And in the myths, they're encoded as the correct way to perform smithing rituals, as the sacred procedures that the god revealed, as the divine knowledge passed from master to apprentice. Consider the symbolism. Smith gods are often described as lame or crippled. Hephaestus in Greek mythology. Wayland the smith in Norse tradition. This seems like an odd detail. Why are smith gods disabled? One theory. Master smiths, working with toxic metals and breathing forge fumes for years, often developed health problems. Lead poisoning causes neurological damage. Arsenic bronze, used before tin bronze became standard, is particularly toxic. Long-term exposure cripples. The lame smith god might encode a warning. This work damages you. The knowledge is valuable, but it comes at a price. The sacred forges in temples weren't just religious symbols. They were working metallurgical facilities. The priests of smith gods were actual smiths, maintaining technical knowledge, training apprentices, conducting the dangerous work of smelting and alloying. Making these forges sacred ensured they'd be maintained. Ensured resources would be allocated to them. Ensured the knowledge wouldn't be lost because metallurgical work was too dangerous or difficult. Religious obligation overcomes practical reluctance. There are myths describing gods marrying to produce offspring. The marriage of sky god and earth goddess produces the harvest. The marriage of fire and water produces various results depending on the specific tradition. These divine marriages often encode chemical processes. The marriage of copper and tin produces bronze. But you can't just say that in a myth. You personify the metals. Copper becomes a god or goddess with specific attributes. Reddish, soft, malleable. Tin becomes another with its own properties. Silvery, crystalline, lower melting point. Their marriage is the alloying process. Their offspring is bronze, which inherits properties from both parents, but is superior to either alone. This isn't primitive thinking. This is sophisticated encoding of metallurgical relationships. And it works. A smith who learns the myths learns the relationships between metals, learns which combinations produce what results, learns the family tree of alloys. The colors of metals are described in myths with great specificity. Gold never tarnishes. Silver shines but darkens. Copper reddens. Iron rusts. These aren't just poetic observations. They encode chemical properties. oxidation resistance, reactivity, which metals are noble, which are base, which are unstable. A smith who knows the myths knows which metals can be left exposed to air and which must be protected, knows which will corrode in water and which won't, knows which require careful storage and which are stable. Practical metallurgical knowledge, encoded as the eternal nature of the divine, the purity of the sacred, the corruption of the profane. Temperature is the most critical variable in metallurgy. Too cool and metals won't melt or alloy properly. Too hot and you burn off components or oxidize the metal. Different metals require different temperatures. Different processes require different heat levels. How do you encode temperature knowledge without thermometers? You describe the forge fire, the sacred fire that must be just right. Not too weak, not too strong. The myths describe the color of flames, the behavior of metal in the heat, the signs that tell you when temperature is correct. Red heat, orange heat, yellow heat, white heat. Each corresponds to a temperature range, each suitable for different metalworking operations. The smith god's fire, described in myth, teaches temperature control through visual cues that a metalworker can actually use. There's even failure encoded in the myths. Not all divine weapons are successfully forged on the first attempt. Some crack, some shatter, some don't hold an edge. The failures teach as much as the successes. They encode what goes wrong when you get the procedure wrong, when the alloy ratio is off, when the temperature isn't right, when the cooling is too fast or too slow. Trial and error, documented in mythology, preserved as divine narrative. The god's struggles in creating perfect weapons encode the metalsmith's struggles in mastering the craft. And by preserving the failures along with the successes, the myths teach diagnostics. If your bronze is brittle, you added too much tin. If it won't hold an edge, not enough. If it cracked during forging, you worked it too cold. The knowledge survives. Encoded in stories about gods and heroes, divine smiths and sacred forges, marriages of metals and births of alloys. And it works. The formulas produce functional bronze. The techniques create strong, sharp, durable tools and weapons. The code, when decoded, yields practical metallurgy. 5,000 years ago, someone understood chemistry well enough to create alloys, understood heat treatment and work hardening and controlled cooling, understood which combinations of metals produced which properties, and they encoded that understanding in myths that would survive the collapse of their civilization, that would travel across cultures, that would preserve the knowledge until metalworkers in distant times and places could decode it and use it. The divine weapons were never magic. They were encoded formulas. The sacred forge was never supernatural. It was a preserved technology. The smith god's hidden knowledge was never mystical. It was practical metallurgy, wrapped in religious narrative, protected by sacred tradition, transmitted through ritual and story. And every piece of metal you own, every steel tool, every bronze sculpture, every copper wire, exists because someone, long ago, figured out how to encode the knowledge of metalworking in a form that would survive anything. In myths about gods who knew the secrets of transforming earth into metal, darkness into light, soft copper into hard bronze, the forge code is written in fire. The manual is disguised as divine mystery, but the knowledge is real, practical, testable. And when you decode it, when you understand what the myths are really teaching, the ancient smiths speak to you across 5,000 years. Not in mystical whispers, in practical instruction, in formulas that work, in techniques that produce results, in knowledge preserved because it was too valuable to lose, encoded because stories survive when everything else burns. The gods of the forge weren't magic. They were master craftsmen, and their secrets, properly understood, are the secrets of chemistry and metallurgy, waiting patiently, in myth, for someone wise enough to recognize science, hiding in stories about divine fire and sacred metal. Chapter 7. Medicine, the healing code. Pain is universal. Sickness is universal. And so is the desperate human need to heal. The ancient Sumerians got sick just like we do. Infections, fevers, broken bones, difficult childbirths, wounds that wouldn't heal, diseases that spread through families, through cities. and they developed medicine to fight back. Sophisticated medicine that, when we examine it today, turns out to have been remarkably effective. They performed surgeries. They set broken bones with splints designed to hold alignment during healing. They treated infections with substances that modern analysis confirms have genuine antibiotic properties. They had pharmacological knowledge. Which plants to use for which conditions, how to prepare them, what dosages worked. They knew things they shouldn't have known. Not with the scientific tools available to them. Not through random trial and error. The learning curve should have been much longer, much bloodier. But somehow, they had working medical knowledge surprisingly early in their civilization's development. The myths, once again, provide an answer. And once again, it's encoded in divine figures who weren't performing miracles, but rather personifying medical knowledge. The primary healing goddess was Ninisina, though she had other names in different periods. Gula, Nintinuga, Bao, different names, but the same essential divine identity, the lady who restores health, the great physician, the knower of healing arts. In the myths, Ninisina possesses medical knowledge that she sometimes shares with worthy humans, creating the first doctors. These chosen individuals learn the healing arts directly from the goddess, then practice them among the people. They become her priests, performing healing in her name. Surface reading, goddess grants magical healing powers. Divine intervention cures the sick. Deeper reading, medical knowledge is transmitted from an expert source to trained practitioners. These practitioners work in temple facilities, which were, effectively, ancient hospitals. They follow specific procedures taught by the goddess, which are, effectively, medical protocols. The texts describe Ninisina as having the plant of life and the water of life, poetic language for divine power. Right. But look closer. Plants of life aren't mystical. They're medicinal herbs. Specific plants with specific healing properties, and the texts name them. Willow bark, myrrh, various roots and leaves, each associated with treating specific conditions. Modern pharmacology has tested many of these ancient remedies, and they work. Willow bark contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin. Myrrh has genuine antiseptic properties. The Sumerian pharmacopoeia wasn't superstition. It was functional medicine, encoded as the goddess's sacred plants. Water of life is more interesting. In the medical texts, it's not just any water. It's water prepared in specific ways. Boiled water, which we now know kills pathogens. Water mixed with specific plant extracts, creating medicinal solutions. Water used to clean wounds, preventing infection. The goddess's water of life encodes the crucial understanding that clean water is essential for healing, that wounds must be washed, that certain water preparations have medicinal properties, that hydration matters in treating illness. This is practical medical knowledge, described in religious language, preserved through association with divine healing. The temple hospitals weren't just places where priests prayed over sick people. They were medical facilities where trained practitioners applied genuine medical knowledge. Diagnosis, treatment, surgery, pharmaceutical preparation, all conducted as religious practice, ensuring the preservation and transmission of medical expertise. Consider surgical procedures. The texts describe operations for cataracts, for bladder stones, for abscesses. They describe instruments. Bronze blades, copper probes, specific tools for specific procedures. They describe techniques. How to make incisions, how to cauterize, how to close wounds, and they describe these as rituals. Sacred procedures that must be performed exactly right, in the correct sequence, with the proper tools, while invoking the goddess. This isn't because the goddess magically guides the surgeon's hand. It's because encoding surgery as sacred ritual ensures that procedures are performed consistently, that proven techniques are followed precisely, that innovations are carefully tested before being adopted. Make surgery a religious ceremony, and you create quality control. You ensure that practitioners don't improvise recklessly. You maintain standards of practice. You preserve what works and discourage dangerous experimentation. The medical texts also describe what we'd call differential diagnosis. Lists of symptoms associated with different diseases. instructions on how to distinguish between conditions that might appear similar but require different treatments. Fever with rash versus fever without. Cough that brings up blood versus cough that doesn't. Pain that moves versus pain that stays localized. These diagnostic lists are framed as the goddess's knowledge, as divine wisdom that allows her priests to identify illnesses correctly, but they're actually observational medicine, careful documentation of symptoms and their patterns. Accumulated clinical experience, codified and transmitted. One fascinating detail: the texts warn against certain combinations of treatments. Don't use plant A with plant B. Don't apply hot compresses after using remedy C. These aren't mystical prohibitions. They're warnings about drug interactions, about contraindications, about procedures that work individually but cause problems when combined. How did they know about drug interactions? Through observation, through documentation, through maintaining records of what worked and what didn't. The temple hospitals weren't just treatment centers. They were research facilities, accumulating medical knowledge over generations. And that knowledge was encoded as religious teaching. The goddess's prohibitions, the sacred rules of healing. This ensured that dangerous combinations would be avoided, that hard-learned lessons wouldn't be forgotten, that each generation of healers would benefit from the accumulated experience of all previous generations. There's even encoded knowledge about contagion, diseases that spread through contact. The texts describe certain conditions as requiring isolation of the patient, as being dangerous to those who approach the sick person, as contaminating objects the patient touches. They didn't have germ theory. They didn't understand viruses or bacteria. But they understood, through observation, that some diseases spread and others don't. And they encoded that understanding in religious purity laws. The sick are ritually unclean. Touching them makes you unclean. Objects they've touched must be purified. This wasn't superstition creating unnecessary suffering. This was infection control, framed in religious terms because that's what made people follow the rules. Quarantine works even if you don't understand the microscopic mechanism. Isolation prevents disease spread even if you think you're avoiding spiritual contamination rather than physical pathogens. The healing goddess's requirements: wash before treating patients, purify instruments with fire or boiling water, isolate contagious cases, dispose of contaminated materials carefully. These are practical medical procedures that save lives. And encoding them as religious obligations ensured they'd be followed consistently. Childbirth receives special attention in the medical texts. There's a goddess specifically for birth. Nintur, Ninhursag, Ninma. Various names for the birth goddess. And she knows secrets. How to position the mother. How to assist delivery. When to intervene and when to wait. How to handle complications. This is obstetric knowledge, personified as divine expertise. And it was taught to midwives, who practiced as the goddess's servants, who learned techniques that reduced mortality in childbirth, that helped both mother and child survive what is, even now, a dangerous process. The texts describe turning breech babies, managing hemorrhage, dealing with retained placenta. These are sophisticated interventions, and they're described as the goddess's gifts, as secret knowledge she shares with her chosen practitioners. Modern medicine has confirmed that many of these techniques are effective. That ancient Sumerian midwifery represented genuine medical knowledge, not lucky guesswork. The methods work. The goddess's secrets were real. There's even psychological medicine encoded in the healing myths. The goddess who can drive away the demon of despair, the incantations that calm anxiety, the rituals that help patients endure pain. We might call this the placebo effect, or the therapeutic value of hope, or simply good bedside manner. But the Sumerians understood that healing involves the mind as well as the body, that patients who believe they'll recover often do better than patients who despair, and they encoded that understanding in the goddess's power over spirits and demons. Depression wasn't a chemical imbalance to them. It was a demon. But treating it, providing hope, creating expectation of healing, conducting rituals that engage the patient's will to live. That's practical medical psychology, whatever you call the underlying mechanism. The healing code is perhaps the most directly practical of all the encoded sciences, because medicine is immediate, personal, life or death. You can't fake medical knowledge. It either works or people die. And Sumerian medicine worked well enough that their techniques spread across the ancient world, were adopted by other cultures, influenced medical practice for thousands of years. The goddess Ninisina wasn't performing miracles, but her priesthood was preserving and practicing real medicine. Knowledge encoded as divine healing, protected by religious authority, transmitted through temple training, maintained because it was sacred and therefore too important to lose. And when someone prays to a healing deity, when they undergo medical ritual, when they receive treatment in a sacred context, they're participating in a knowledge preservation system that's functioned for 5,000 years. That's kept medical expertise alive through the collapse of civilizations. That's encoded the wisdom of healers in stories about gods, so that wisdom wouldn't die when the healers did. The goddess still heals, not through magic, but through the knowledge she represents. Knowledge that survives in encoded form, waiting for those wise enough to recognize practical medicine, hiding in myths about divine physicians who knew the secrets of plants and water, of diagnosis and surgery, of treating both body and spirit. The healing code, like all the others, worked. And it still works, because the knowledge it encodes is real. The goddess's gifts were never supernatural. They were scientific. Medicine disguised as divinity, preserved across millennia, still teaching those who know how to decode the myths. Chapter 8. Why Encode? The preservation strategy. We've decoded 7 sciences now. Mathematics, astronomy, hydraulic engineering, genetics, agriculture, metallurgy, medicine. 7 bodies of knowledge, all encoded in myths about gods, all preserved for 5,000 years, all still functional when you extract them from their mythological packaging. That's not coincidence. That's not accident. That's design. So now we need to ask the bigger question. Why? Why encode knowledge this way? Why not just write it down plainly? Why wrap science in religion, facts in stories, procedures in divine narratives? The answer is both simple and profound, because civilizations are fragile, and knowledge, without protection, disappears. Think about what destroys knowledge. Fire destroys libraries. War destroys cities. Conquest destroys cultures. Languages evolve and die, making old texts unreadable. Writing systems are forgotten. Stone tablets crack and crumble. Papyrus rots. Even when physical records survive, they can become incomprehensible if the context is lost, if the technical terminology is forgotten, if the framework for understanding them disappears. This happens over and over throughout history. The Library of Alexandria burns. Roman engineering knowledge is lost in the Dark Ages. Mayan mathematics vanishes with their civilization. Greek fire's formula is forgotten. Entire bodies of sophisticated knowledge simply disappear, and later civilizations have to rediscover them from scratch. The people who encoded science in Sumerian myths understood this danger. They'd either witnessed it themselves, or they were wise enough to anticipate it. And they developed a solution. Make knowledge memorable. Make it sacred. Make it narrative. Embed it in stories that people will tell their children, that priests will recite in temples, that will survive even when everything else is lost. Stories are humanity's most durable storage medium. More durable than stone, because stone can be broken. More durable than writing, because writing can be lost or become unreadable. Stories survive in human memory, passed from generation to generation, adaptable enough to fit new contexts while preserving their essential content. But stories alone aren't enough. People forget stories. Details change. Information degrades with each retelling. So you need a preservation mechanism that maintains accuracy across generations. Religion provides that mechanism. Make a story sacred, and people preserve it carefully. Make knowledge part of religious practice, and institutions form to maintain it. Make procedures into rituals, and they'll be performed the same way, generation after generation, even if people forget why they're doing them. This is brilliant information architecture. Multi-layered, redundant, robust. Layer 1. The myth itself. The narrative that's memorable, that spreads easily, that survives in oral tradition. This preserves the basic structure of the knowledge. Layer 2. Religious ritual. The ceremonies that enact the myths, that practice the procedures, that physically demonstrate the techniques. This preserves the practical application even if the theoretical understanding is lost. Layer 3. Temple institutions. The priesthoods that maintain both myths and rituals, that train new generations, that have the resources and authority to preserve knowledge across centuries. This provides institutional continuity. Layer 4. Sacred prohibition. The religious laws that prevent alteration or loss. You can't change the sacred rituals. You can't abandon the divine procedures. You can't question the goddess's wisdom. This protects knowledge from being modified or discarded by people who don't understand its importance. This system is designed to survive anything. If writing is lost, the oral tradition continues. If temples are destroyed, the stories survive in the people. If one priesthood falls, another civilization adopts the myths and continues the practices. If the theoretical understanding disappears, the practical procedures encoded in ritual keep working. And it's designed to work even when people don't understand what they're preserving. A farmer who follows the sacred calendar doesn't need to understand astronomy. He just needs to plant when the religious calendar says to plant. But the calendar itself encodes astronomical knowledge, preserved through his ritual compliance even though he doesn't comprehend the underlying science. A smith who performs the sacred forging rituals doesn't need to understand metallurgical chemistry. He just needs to follow the procedures exactly as the god commands. But those procedures encode chemical knowledge, preserved through his religious obedience, even though he doesn't grasp the principles. This is knowledge preservation that works even across periods of civilizational decline. Even through dark ages, when theoretical understanding collapses, the practices continue because they're sacred. And when civilization recovers, when people begin to question and analyze again, the encoded knowledge is still there, waiting to be rediscovered. We see this pattern in other cultures too. Indigenous peoples worldwide have myths that turn out to encode genuine knowledge. Aboriginal Australian stories preserve 10,000 years of coastal geography changes, including sea level rise from the end of the Ice Age. Native American legends describe volcanic eruptions and earthquakes with geological accuracy. Polynesian myths encode sophisticated navigation techniques that allowed them to colonize the Pacific. These aren't coincidences. These are all examples of the same preservation strategy. Encode practical knowledge in memorable stories. Make the stories sacred so they're protected. Maintain them through ritual and tradition. And trust that future generations will be smart enough to decode them when they need the knowledge. The Sumerians, or whoever taught them, simply did this more systematically than anyone else. They encoded an entire curriculum, multiple sciences, comprehensive knowledge, all wrapped in an integrated mythology, all protected by an elaborate religious system, all designed to survive indefinitely. And it worked. 5,000 years. Multiple civilizational collapses. Languages changing. Empires rising and falling. Entire worldviews being replaced. And the knowledge survived. Not unchanged. Myths evolve. Details shift. But the core information remained intact enough that we can still decode it, still extract functional science from ancient religious texts. That's not luck. That's sophisticated knowledge engineering. That's understanding information theory and human psychology and institutional dynamics at a level we're only beginning to appreciate. When the Sumerian civilization fell, when their cities were conquered and their people scattered, the knowledge didn't die. Because it wasn't stored only in Sumerian libraries or Sumerian schools. It was encoded in myths that the Babylonians adopted, that spread to other cultures, that became part of humanity's common heritage. The base 60 mathematics continued because everyone who used it believed it was divinely ordained. The astronomical knowledge continued because the zodiac was sacred. The agricultural techniques continued because the calendar was religious. The medical knowledge continued because healing was the goddess's gift. Make knowledge sacred, and it becomes nearly indestructible. That's the insight. That's the strategy. And it worked better than any other knowledge preservation system in human history. We sometimes look down on ancient peoples for mixing science and religion, for wrapping practical knowledge in supernatural language. We think we've progressed beyond that. We separate science from faith, facts from values, practical from sacred. But maybe they understood something we've forgotten. Maybe knowledge needs protection. Maybe pure, unadorned technical information is too fragile. Maybe it needs story, meaning, emotional resonance, institutional support. Maybe making knowledge sacred isn't primitive superstition, but sophisticated preservation engineering. The Sumerians created a time capsule, not one that sits buried in the ground, but one that lives in human culture, in stories and rituals and practices. A capsule that adapts to new contexts while preserving its core content. A capsule that's been continuously opened and resealed for 5,000 years, each generation extracting what they need, adding their own interpretations, passing it forward. And we're still opening it, still finding new layers, still discovering that myths we thought we understood contain depths we hadn't recognized, still decoding knowledge that was hidden in plain sight, waiting for us to be wise enough to recognize it. The preservation strategy worked. The knowledge survived. The code endures. And every time we check a clock, plant a field, forge metal, treat an illness, navigate by stars, we're proving that someone, 5,000 years ago, understood how to preserve knowledge across the ages, not by carving it in imperishable stone, but by embedding it in imperishable stories, in myths about gods who never existed, but whose gifts were entirely real. Chapter 9. The Gift That Keeps Giving. So let's come back to where we started. To your watch, to 60 seconds ticking by, one after another, measuring your life in units that were old when Rome was young, ancient when Christ was born, already traditional when the first pharaohs ruled Egypt. You woke up this morning and checked the time. Sumerian mathematics. Maybe you looked at your phone's GPS to navigate somewhere. Sumerian astronomy, marking positions in degrees, minutes, and seconds. You ate food grown through agricultural techniques that the Sumerians encoded. You took medicine whose active ingredients they identified. You used metal tools created through processes they preserved. You benefited from engineering principles they wrapped in myths about water gods. Every single day, multiple times a day, you interact with knowledge that's 5,000 years old. Knowledge that survived because someone, long ago, was brilliant enough to encode it in a form that would outlast their civilization. That's what we've discovered tonight. Not just that ancient myths contain science, but that they were designed to contain it. Deliberately, systematically, as a knowledge preservation strategy more effective than anything we've invented since. Mathematics encoded as divine principles. Astronomy encoded as gods in the heavens. Hydraulic engineering encoded as the deeds of water deities. Genetics encoded in creation stories. Agriculture encoded as divine gifts. Metallurgy encoded as sacred forging. Medicine encoded as the wisdom of healing goddesses. 7 sciences. 7 codes. All broken open. All revealing the same truth. The ancients weren't primitive. They were sophisticated. They understood things we're only beginning to appreciate about how to preserve knowledge across vast timescales. But we still have questions, don't we? Questions we can't answer with certainty even after decoding the myths. Who did the encoding? Was it the Sumerians themselves, brilliant scientists who understood their civilization might fall and wanted to protect their discoveries? Was it the mysterious Anunnaki, whoever or whatever they were, transmitting knowledge to a younger civilization? Was it an even earlier culture, now lost, preserving their science as their world collapsed? We don't know. Maybe we'll never know. The code tells us what was preserved, but it doesn't always tell us who preserved it or why they needed to. And that's okay. Because the gift works regardless of the giver's identity. The mathematics functions whether it came from Sumerian genius or Anunnaki teaching or some unknown precursor civilization. The astronomy is accurate whoever first calculated it. The medicine heals regardless of which goddess's name it was transmitted under. The knowledge is real. The encoding was effective. The preservation succeeded. Those facts remain, whatever mysteries surround them. But here's another question. What else is encoded that we haven't decoded yet? We've cracked 7 major sciences, but Sumerian mythology is vast. Thousands of tablets, hundreds of gods, countless myths and rituals and sacred procedures. How much knowledge are we still missing? How many codes haven't we broken yet? Every year, new tablets are translated. New patterns are recognized. New connections are made. And sometimes, someone reads an ancient myth with fresh eyes and suddenly sees what everyone else missed. The science, hidden in the poetry. The practical, encoded in the sacred. There's almost certainly more waiting to be discovered. More knowledge preserved in forms we haven't recognized yet. More gifts from the ancient world, patiently waiting for us to be wise enough to unwrap them. And here's the question that should concern us most. What are we doing to preserve our knowledge for the future? We have more knowledge than any previous civilization, more than the Sumerians could have imagined. We understand physics and chemistry and biology at levels they couldn't have conceived. We've split the atom, mapped the genome, touched the moon, photographed distant galaxies. But how are we preserving this knowledge? Digital storage. That's fragile. File formats become obsolete. Hardware fails. Electromagnetic pulses could wipe it all. Server farms require constant power and maintenance. If civilization collapsed tomorrow, how much of our digital knowledge would survive even a century? Paper books. Better, but still vulnerable. Libraries burn. Books rot. Languages evolve. Without the cultural context, without the educational system to teach people how to read and interpret technical texts, books become incomprehensible. The Sumerians understood something we seem to have forgotten. Knowledge needs protection. Not just physical protection, but cultural protection. Emotional protection. It needs to be embedded in stories that people care about, practices that people perform, institutions that people maintain. Maybe we need to start encoding again. Not abandoning our technical manuals and scientific papers, but supplementing them. Creating narratives that carry essential knowledge. Making critical information sacred, meaningful, memorable. Building knowledge into culture at a level where it can survive cultural disruption. Because civilizations do collapse. Ours probably will too, eventually. Maybe from climate change. Maybe from war. Maybe from some crisis we haven't imagined yet. And when it does, what will survive? What knowledge will our descendants be able to recover? The Sumerians gave us a model. They showed us it's possible to encode sophisticated science in forms that survive millennia. That outlast the civilization that created them. That remain accessible even to people who don't initially understand what they're looking at. We could learn from that. We could be better ancestors. We could ensure that if our civilization falls, the essential knowledge survives. Not just for our immediate descendants, but for people thousands of years in the future who might need what we've learned. But even if we don't, even if our knowledge proves more fragile than theirs, we can at least honor what they achieved. We can recognize the gift they gave us. We can acknowledge the brilliance of people we often dismiss as primitive, who were sophisticated enough to send knowledge across 5,000 years with remarkable fidelity. Every code we've decoded tonight connects us to them, to the unknown engineers who understood hydraulics, to the anonymous astronomers who mapped the stars, to the nameless physicians who identified healing plants, to the brilliant strategists who designed a knowledge preservation system that worked better than anything before or since. They didn't know us, couldn't have imagined us, lived in a world so different from ours, it's almost incomprehensible. But they gave us gifts anyway. Mathematics and astronomy and agriculture and medicine. Knowledge they hoped would survive them, would reach people they'd never meet, would make life better for humans thousands of years in the future. And it did. It reached us. We're using it right now. Every time you check your watch, you're connected to them. Every time you navigate, plant a seed, forge metal, treat an illness. You're the beneficiary of their foresight, their wisdom, their determination to preserve what mattered. That's beautiful, when you think about it. That's profound. We're part of a chain that stretches back 50 centuries. We received from the past, and maybe, if we're wise, we'll pass something forward to the future. Not in tablets or servers, but in stories and practices and cultural knowledge that can survive whatever's coming. The Anunnaki myths, whether they record gods or aliens, or simply brilliant humans, gave us more than facts. They gave us a method, a system, a proof of concept that knowledge can survive anything if it's properly encoded. So sleep well tonight. Rest knowing that you're part of something larger than yourself, that you stand in a great chain of knowledge transmission stretching backward into the deep past and forward into an unknown future, that what you learned tonight connects you to the earliest stirrings of human civilization and to everyone who will come after. The codes are written. Some are broken. Some remain mysterious. But they all point to the same truth. Knowledge persists. wisdom survives. And someone, somewhere, always cares enough to pass the gift forward. The gods were never real, but their gifts were science wrapped in mythology, knowledge preserved in stories, practical wisdom disguised as divine revelation. And 5,000 years later, the gift keeps giving. The knowledge keeps working. The codes keep revealing their secrets to anyone patient enough to look, wise enough to see, and humble enough to learn from people they once dismissed as primitive. Check your watch. 60 seconds have passed. Each one measured by math that's older than history, preserved by people who understood that some things matter enough to protect forever. They succeeded. The knowledge survived. And now it's ours. To use. To appreciate. To preserve. To pass forward. That's the final code. The ultimate message. Not we were great, but you matter enough to us that we saved this for you, across 50 centuries, hoping you'd be wise enough to find it. We found it. We decoded it. And now we know. The ancient world wasn't simple. The myths weren't just stories. And the gods, real or not, left us gifts we're still unwrapping. Sweet dreams. And may you wake tomorrow a little more connected to the past, a little more aware of the future, a little more grateful for the extraordinary inheritance we carry forward from the brilliant, sophisticated, visionary people who built civilization's foundation. The codes are broken. The knowledge flows. The gift endures.